This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
So we had a bit of an opening tonight. We've been having a monthly historical speaker, and this month our speaker had to postpone because they got called up for jury duty. And we actually sort of had historical speaker last week with Aryashuri Indriya Gita talking about Dardo Rinpoche. In a way, our connection to Dardo Rinpoche. So I just wanted to take advantage of that opening to talk about a theme that we've been talking about on some Sundays in Portsmouth, but tying it into some current events and just some thoughts I've had recently. So the title of tonight's talk is Living a Dharma Life in a World on Fire. And to begin with, I wanted to show you something that you may have seen on the internet. It is a panel from a comic strip that has been made into many memes. So the comic strip is actually longer. It's about 4 more panels, but it's these first 2 panels that have been memeified. This is from a webcomic called Gun Show by K.C. Green. And the character, the little dog there, is apparently known as Question Hound. And Question Hound, of course, is sitting calmly in a house that's on fire. And yeah, as you can see, he says, "This is fine." Or as I hear it in my mind, "This is fine," in a cartoon voice. The comic strip continues, and he eventually ends up melting, which is, it was a little too graphic to show you tonight. This image of sitting in the house on fire and saying "this is fine" is actually quite Buddhist in a way. So in very early Buddhism, the Buddha gave a famous talk known as the Fire Sermon. This was said to have occurred pretty early after his waking up. And I have an excerpt to read you from that to give you a sense of the strength with which he was speaking. And he says, "Mendicants, all is burning. And what is the all that is burning? The eye is burning. Sights are burning. Eye consciousness is burning. Eye contact is burning. The painful, pleasant, or neutral feeling that arises conditioned by eye contact is also burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fires of greed, hate, and delusion. Burning with rebirth, old age, and death. With sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress." So he goes through the senses, saying the same things, including the mind. And it's a striking vision to say that essentially the state of being a human being is a state of being on fire. It's an urgent image, isn't it? If you're on fire, you're supposed to what? Stop, drop, and roll. Right. So, there's a real sense of urgency there. But he's speaking so directly. He's saying, "Look, you're on fire. The human situation is that you're on fire." So it's a very extreme thing to say. Later on in the Buddhist tradition, there in the White Lotus Sutra, there is what is known as the parable of the burning house, which the dog in the comic strip is sitting in the burning house. And in this image, there are children who are playing in the burning house, unaware that the house is on fire and unaware that they're in danger. And their father in this parable, who is the Buddha, is standing outside of the house, calling to them to leave the house. But they remain blissfully unaware of the danger that they're in. There's a lot more to that parable that we don't have the time to go into tonight, but the image of itself stands alone, that the humanity lives in a burning house. The Buddha, who represents the opportunity to liberate oneself from that burning house, is contrasted with that. So, and there's a relationship to these images of being on fire or being in a burning house to the vision that the Buddha had before his enlightenment, where he was really struck by the human condition, the suffering of the human condition. So, according to the Buddha, we are always living in a world that's on fire. And to live a Dharma life is always to do so in a world on fire. And there are times when the heat is turned up. There are times when our Dharma practice becomes more crucial because things feel more unstable. And this can be something internal. It might be a sudden loss or a change, an unwanted change, or a challenge that we have to face. And it could be something happening around us, in the world around us or with the people around us. And many in the United States are feeling the heat now turned up. And it's not just in the headlines of the news. I have friends and associates from communities of color, which make up about 43% of the population in the United States. I have friends and associates in the LGBTQ plus community, which make up about 8%, an estimated 8% of the population in the United States. And I have many women friends and associates who make up just over 50% of the U.S. population, who are feeling the heat of hate speech and policy changes that strip them of their rights. I have friends and relatives who work for the federal government that are receiving intimidating emails and the threat of losing their jobs. I have friends who were not born in the United States but who are living here legally, who are concerned about being detained and deported. I have a friend who works for a library. My mother relies on Social Security for her income and her medical insurance. And at Aryaloka, someone from Canada who was booked on one of our retreats coming up canceled because the Canadian government warned Canadian citizens not to enter the United States unless it was absolutely essential. And she did not want to risk being detained at the border, even though her trip would have been perfectly legal. So it is feeling rather hot at the moment, and it's not fine. So how does this relate to our spiritual lives? So the Buddha, before he was the Buddha, he felt the heat of the human condition. He experienced the four sights, which we talked about recently in Portsmouth on Sunday. He experienced the reality that human life was impermanent, and he saw that through the through the reality of seeing people age, seeing people get sick, seeing people die. The fourth sight being a vision of an ascetic who represented the possibility of change in the face of that human reality. And this vision of human life as being extraordinarily difficult was initially what drove him to leave the comfort and the privilege of his life and to go off into the wilds of India to practice meditation and to see if there was some solution to the problem of human suffering. So that was the Buddha's response, and this quality of going forth is still important to us as Buddhists today. The world, or samsara, samsara being a word which means sort of wandering through the cycle of things, is always unreliable as a source of lasting happiness and safety. So we know that samsara is impermanent, that things change. We know that because of that, and because we grasp at things in a particular way, that we tend to create suffering for ourselves. And that if we're not careful, if our lives remain unexamined, we just tend to cycle through those processes of trying to find happiness and losing it, and trying to find satiation and then feeling hungry again, however you want to think of it. And the Buddhist response to this endless, what is considered an endless cycle of craving, satiation, and then dissatisfaction, is to abandon it, is to rather abandon our reliance on that cycle. Not to abandon the suffering of others, not to abandon our processes of change and transformation, but to leave behind our reliance upon the world in a particular way. And nirvana, by way of contrast, is spoken of poetically as a blowing out, a quenching or a cooling of the mental poisons that we are on fire with. So nirvana as the goal of the Buddhist path is this sense that those poisons which cause us pain, which light us on fire, which light the world on fire, are quenched, are put out. And so there's a tremendous sense of relief represented in that image. And nirvana for everybody is the goal of Buddhist life. Not just individual waking up, but nirvana for everybody. We all get our nirvana. Historically, in relation to going forth, it's quite often monasticism which has been held up as the ideal way to do that. And for some people, this is still the ideal way to do that in the modern world, is to take the vows of a traditional Buddhist monastic. Our order, as you may have already noticed, is not a monastic order. And this was intentional right from the beginning. Bhante Sangharakshita, our teacher and the founder of our order, wanted to create a Buddhist movement that was accessible to anyone who wished to live an effective Buddhist life. Our ordination is neither monastic nor lay, and commitment to Dharma practice is seen as what is primarily important, whereas lifestyle is seen as being of secondary importance, however, not unimportant, as he was careful to point out later. Lifestyle will be a reflection of our commitment to Dharma practice. So going forth is quite an interesting topic. In some ways, monasticism is clearer because there's just such a clear cutting off from the concerns of daily life that many of us have to struggle with. And such a clear cutting off from things that tend to emotionally invest us in various attachments. Going forth while maintaining a career or raising a family or both, or while going to school, or while engaging in activist work, or while making a living as a gardener, All these possibilities in modern life can be intense areas in which to practice the Dharma, and they can also be areas where we compromise our values and seek false refuge. So I wanted to say just a few things about ways in which we can embody the spirit of going forth, ways in which we can intensify Dharma practice, first as personal practice and then as practice for others, for the community. So the first thing, get yourself on retreat. If your life is not retreat-like, we have this wonderful opportunity to enter retreat conditions occasionally. When we go on retreats, we're eliminating a lot of the usual distractions that we might occupy ourselves with, and we're taking ourselves out of context. Both of those things are really important, and it's an opportunity to live more directly in relation to our Dharma practices without some of the usual day-to-day worries, concerns, or labors. So retreat life is an excellent way to go forth in a larger context where perhaps we have a lot of other responsibilities. So going on retreat is a great way in the modern world and in this context to go forth. The second thing I want to say, I started thinking about this the other day, and what I came up with was to make the conventional unconventional. This is how I chose to phrase this. Almost everything we do has the potential to be Dharma practice when it's done with mindfulness, kindness, and a sense of purpose. Almost everything that we do can be Dharma practice. So don't just eat. Eat mindfully with a sense of appreciation and a vision of interconnection. Don't just talk. Communicate like a bodhisattva with the qualities of truth, kindness, helpfulness, and harmony as your guide. Don't just work. Work with awareness and with an eye for opportunities where you can practice generosity or relieve discord between people. Don't just call your senator. Call your senator as a practice of communicating truth, reason, and compassion. So you get the picture. All of these mundane activities can be imbued with dharmic significance, can be imbued as a practice of self-transformation. Another thing we can do is we can reflect on and we can examine the conditions in our lives that conduce to busyness and anxiety. And we can look at if there's anything in that ball of stuff that we can let go of, that we can be done with. Is there anything that we can go forth from that we don't need to trouble ourselves with? Another thing we can do is to meditate daily, to really commit to cultivating higher consciousness, to cultivating the mind, even if it's not a very long time, but to cultivate this practice of internal depth and contentment that will lead to a truer happiness. We can also avoid participation in consumer culture. This is one way that many of us are fooled into thinking that the source of happiness is through things, is through achievements, and through the acquiring of wealth and objects. So we can begin to ask ourselves, do I want this or do I need it? Will this enhance my life or make it more complicated? We can limit our possessions and give things away that inevitably leave our lives more cluttered. You're probably all familiar with that wonderful feeling of spring cleaning that you get when you're finally able to open the windows and to do spring cleaning. When you're done with it, it feels wonderful and things feel refreshed. Well, imagine doing that more often by just offloading things that are inevitably troubling or that promise happiness but don't really give it. Don't try and skip over basic life activities like eating and sleeping. enjoy those processes and engage with them as a reflection of a self-metta practice. And finally, in line with the altruistic spirit of the Buddha's teaching, save the world. As you deepen your going forth, you become more reliable. As you deepen your going forth, you become more reliable. You don't always want to be more reliable. It's kind of like being good at your job. What happens when you're good at your job?
You get more work.
You get more work. Not always with more money. But naturally, through being an effective Buddhist, you become more trustworthy. This because you are becoming less selfish and more other-regarding. So how do you effectively give expression to that? There's, I think, a lot of ways to talk about that. Tonight, I just wanted to mention that when we talk about compassion, which is karuna or compassion, we're talking about the quality of metta or loving kindness that is present when we come into contact with the suffering of other living beings, human or otherwise. So when we're in a state of loving kindness and we see someone suffering, our response changes to karuna. And in the solar imagery in which those qualities are talked about, metta or loving kindness is said to be like the sun at noon, shining on all things without discrimination. And metta as compassion is said to be like the sunset. Yeah, it's the sun going down in the west. So it's you can kind of feel your way into that image, right? You know, the quality of the noonday sun versus the quality of the setting sun has both beautiful, but there's a different vibe. So compassion is the response to suffering. And very usefully in Buddhist teaching, there are said to be enemies of compassion, some of which are close to you and some of which are far away. I can't help myself when I talk about this, but to bring up the image from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where there's two guards guarding the castle, and they're seeing the enemy, who I believe, if I remember correctly, is King Arthur approaching me with the coconuts. Yeah. And was it Sir Lancelot? Yeah. And for ages, they're looking and looking, and this enemy is in the distance, and the scene keeps changing. And, you know, you see you see Sir Lancelot, and then you see the guards looking at Sir Lancelot, and the distance never closes until suddenly it closes, and I won't tell you what happens next, but suddenly the enemy's upon them. And I feel like the near and far enemies of compassion are a bit like that. So the far enemy of compassion you can see coming from a mile away. That's why it's the far enemy. And the far enemy of compassion is cruelty. It's the intentional infliction of suffering on another living being. So that's what's contrasted with compassion. The near enemy, which is suddenly upon you and which might even trick you into thinking it's the real thing, there's two dimensions to that. There's pity, which is the there response that keeps the suffering of someone else at arm's length and below you. So there. It's not really a connected, compassionate response. It's just pity. And then, of course, there's horrified anxiety, which is the sense of overwhelm with the suffering of the world. And the quite often that overwhelm becomes inaction. It becomes an inability to act effectively because we're so taken aback by the horror that we are witnessing. Quite a natural response to terrible things. We see things these days that we never used to see in times of conflict in the world. We see videos that people take on their phones where people are being killed. Yeah, we see these in social media all the time now. So it's easy to feel overwhelmed by that. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the headlines and to experience a stunned state of horrified anxiety in relation to it. So we can watch carefully for those near enemies, and we can begin to orient ourselves towards a more compassionate response. If we learn to recognize pity in horrified anxiety, we can realize, I'm not in that compassionate space, and we can sort out what we need to do to adjust so that we are in a more effective, compassionate space. And this will take the inner work of meditation. It will take the sitting down dedication of stillness in meditation. It'll take the support of our Dharma friends and the good communication that we engage with our Dharma friends and other communities that support compassionate response. And it will take the outer work of actually effectively changing the world. How you change the world might be determined by your direct circumstances and by necessity, or it might be determined by something you choose to align yourself with a particular concern. So this is some advice I've been seeing quite a lot recently, is if you are experiencing overwhelm, one of the things you can do to be more effective in your compassion is to choose something that you can actually respond to and actually change in a positive way. So that could be any number of things depending on who we are, some of which might be within our circles of friends and family, and some of which might be more socially engaged with organizations, nonprofits, and that sort of thing. Whatever it might be, now is definitely the time to do it. If you've been holding back out of indecision or not knowing how or not having the time, now is the time to clarify all of that and to step up. In Aryaloka's 40th year, considering the current state of the world, I'd say the life of our spiritual community is more crucial than ever. So let's use that life to be the helpers. To finish up this evening, I wanted to consult our beloved historical teacher, Shanti Deva. And I wanted to read what he was essentially saying about compassion and waking up. With the good acquired by doing all this as described, may I allay all the suffering of every living being. I am medicine for the sick. May I be both the doctor and their nurse until the sickness does not recur. May I avert the pain of hunger and thirst with showers of food and drink. May I become both drink and food in the intermediate aeons of famine. May I be an inexhaustible treasure for impoverished beings. May I wait upon them with various forms of offering. See, I give up without regret my bodies, my pleasures, and my good acquired in all three times, to accomplish good for every being. Abandonment of all is enlightenment, and enlightenment is my heart's goal. If I must give up everything, better it be given to sentient beings. I am the protector of the unprotected and the caravan leader for travelers. I have become the boat, the causeway, and the bridge for those who long to reach the further shore. May I be a light for those in need of light. May I be a bed for those in need of rest. May I be a servant for those in need of service, for all embodied beings. For embodied beings, may I be the wish-fulfilling jewel, the pot of plenty, the spell that always works, the potent healing herb, the magical tree that grants every wish, and the milk cow that supplies all wants. Just as earth and the other elements are profitable in many ways to the immeasurable beings dwelling throughout space, so may I be sustenance of many kinds for the realm of beings throughout space, until all have attained release. In the same way as bygone Sugatas took up the awakening mind, in the same way as they progressed in the bodhisattva training, so too I myself shall generate the awakening mind for the welfare of the world, and just so shall I train in those precepts in due order. The wise one who has taken up the awakening mind with a serene confidence in this way should continue to encourage their resolve as follows in order to fulfill the wish. Today my birth is fruitful, my human life is justified. Today I am born into the family of the Buddha. Now I am the Buddha's child. So that there may be no blemish upon this spotless family, I must now act as becomes my family. As a blindfolded person might find a jewel in a heap of rubbish, so too this awakening mind has somehow appeared in me. This is the elixir of life, born to end death in the world. This is the inexhaustible treasure, alleviating poverty in the world. This is the supreme medicine, curing the sickness of the world, a tree of shelter for weary creatures, staggering along the road of existence. The causeway to cross over bad rebirths, open to all who travel. It is the rising moon of the mind, mitigating the defilements of the world. It is the brilliant sun, dispelling the mist of ignorance from the world. It is the fresh butter risen up from churning the milk of the true Dharma. For the caravan of humanity, traveling the road of existence, hungry for the enjoyment of happiness, this is a feast of happiness offered as refreshment to all beings who approach. Today, I summon the world to Buddhahood and to worldly happiness meanwhile. In the presence of all the saviors, may gods, titans, and all rejoice.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.